Should we make pornography illegal? That's coming up on the Maren Show. Stick with us. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Maren Show on LifeSiteNews.com. Today we're going to be discussing whether or not the United States of America should ban pornography, and if they do, how that would be done. To discuss that, we're talking to Terry Schilling, who is the Executive Director of the American Principles Project. He's worked in communications development, grassroots, and management positions with Representative Chris Smith, Senator Sam Brownback, and a number of other politicians, and he works to figure out how to make socially conservative principles actual government policy. His article in First Things on how to regulate pornography triggered a discussion on whether or not the conservative movement should back the banning of pornography, and he agreed to come on the Maren Show to discuss that. So without further introduction from me, this is Terry Schilling and our discussion on how and whether to ban pornography. Maybe you can first summarize for our listeners and our viewers this debate that's gone on inside the conservative movement for the last 6 weeks to a couple of months here on the issue of pornography.
Yeah, so about 5 or 6 months ago, there was this debate started, I think in large part from an article that I wrote for First Things titled How to Regulate Online Pornography. And it's broken down into basically two camps on the right. You have the libertarians who would prefer no government regulation or restrictions on online pornography, with the exception of probably child pornography. And then you have the more conservative side of the aisle, and even that's a little bit split up. You have people from Matt Walsh, who's advocating for an all-out pornography ban, to more practical people who just want to do age verification or domain zoning, stuff like that, that would be less intrusive but allow for the protection of children. But it's been a fascinating debate that we've seen roll out. It's an important debate that we should be having. That's one of the things that's really been puzzling to me, is that in the 20 years since the Supreme Court struck down the Communications Decency Act, or at least the large part of it that protected children from online pornography, there really hasn't been any action or any debate surrounding pornography. They've just kind of, the movement and American society and politicians have just kind of moved on. And we've reached a point where I think online pornography has gotten a little bit out of control, to say the least. And children are starting to access it quite frequently. The average age of first exposure to pornography is actually 11 years old. And that's just for children in general. That's not even counting, the differences between boys and girls. So it's a major problem. It's a debate that we need to have, and it's a problem that we need to address.
I couldn't agree more. And it's interesting that you mentioned the 1997 Supreme Court decision, because I write a lot about pornography. I've given a lot of presentations at high schools and things like that on the issue. It is the number one moral issue that I think threatens the future of social conservatism and a lot of Christian communities, if you look at the rate at which pornography is infecting families and communities and churches. But one thing a lot of people ask me in response to the things that I've written about this is well, why can't we ban pornography when you describe the fact that, 10-year-olds, the average 10-year-old has seen a gangbang by that age online already? They say, well, can't something be done about this? So I guess to sort of set this stage, what is the legal framework that exists? What are the restrictions on banning porn? Where are we at with all this? Because I think for most people, we went from the Ronald Reagan era war on obscenity to this, and they don't really have any conceptualization of what happened in between those two things. Yeah,
so if you go back to the ACLU versus Reno case, this is the case that struck down most of this Communications Decency Act. They mostly struck it down because they said that the burden on pornography users was too great. And what was that burden at the time? The burden was that you had to have a credit card to verify your age. And they said that burden was too great. Well, if you look at that, and this is what's funny about the Supreme Court and government in general, is that they really have no foresight. In this decision, they wrote that the internet was not as pervasive as radio or television, and thus didn't meet the same standards for censorship or regulation. However, the Supreme Court, while they struck down most of the Communications Decency Act, they did not strike down the existing statutes on the books that restrict obscenity, the transmission of obscenity across airwaves, including especially transmitting obscenities to minors. Though there are laws on the books right now that basically outlaw online pornography, however, they're not being enforced or pursued by our current legal establishment. And so part of our tactic here has been to work with members of Congress and ask questions for example, why are these statutes that are already on the books blocking obscenities not being applied to the internet today? Why are we allowing 11-year-olds or 8-year-olds even with access to the internet to be able to access obscene material simply by checking a box and saying that they're 18 years old? But it goes back to this argument, and it's really foolish that the First Amendment protects pornography, and that it's an act of free expression, it's an act of art, and that there can be no regulations that permit it. But are permitted that are constitutional. But that's just absurd. Pornography is not protected under the First Amendment. It's obscenity, and we not only have every right to regulate it, we have every duty to regulate it and restrict it where we can.
And that brings me to your article in November 2019, your First Things piece, which I really, really thought was fantastic, because I've seen a lot of conservatives sort of make blanket arguments about banning porn, all of which I am extremely in favor of, just because I've dealt a lot with the fallout from pornography, these kids who have been permanently poisoned. And I got an email from a kid in grade 12 a while ago. He stumbled across porn for the first time when he was in the 6th grade. He said, I can't even talk to a girl right now without thousands of images of naked people and all these horrible things that I've seen online flash through my head. His head was just clogged with this filth before he was even of the age that he had started dating people, right? This kid had seen gangbangs before he'd ever held a girl's hand. And it's unacceptable that kids are being robbed of these very normal experiences. And that's why regulating pornography, I think, is something a lot of people could get on board with if they realize just how bad it was. But you have Matt Walsh who says, let's just ban it. Ross Douthat actually proposed something similar in the New York Times early last year. But your article, your essay here, was the first one that actually laid out ways that this could, in fact, be done, which is one of the reasons I appreciated it so much. So maybe lay out for the listeners and the viewers, how do you think we could constitutionally tackle the porn issue in a way that wouldn't get struck down by the courts? How could we take some steps to start keeping this garbage away from kids in a way that would actually hold up, a protection that would be lasting?
Well, the most robust and I think the most practical proposal that I laid out was a opt-in to adult content feature that we require of internet service providers. So this is something that's actually been implemented and tried in Great Britain, and it's been experimented with. And the opt-in method to adult content online is a very effective way at combating pornography, especially when it comes to putting it in the hands of children. But basically what this would do is the internet, when you order it, so you're a family, you're married, husband and wife, and you've got some kids, when you order the internet, it's going to come just like your cable package. It's going to come just like your radio, in that you will get a filtered version of the internet that does not include adult content. And if you want to access that adult content, you can call up your internet service provider and you can change the filters. So in Great Britain, what they have is very similar to what our Motion Picture Association of America has implemented with its rating system. They have a G, a PG-13 rating, and then an unfiltered version of the internet. So it's basically just asking internet service providers and internet companies to live by the same standards that we ask for every other media company in this country when it comes to music and television and all of that. The internet really, it's so odd how people view the internet. They almost talk about it as if it's this loophole beyond all laws and all common decency, when in fact it's not. It's just another form of our culture. It's another form of our society, and it's online. And the same laws and rules should apply to the online world that apply to the physical world. And, I've had a lot of criticism of my proposals. One of the other ones is just simply age verification, an age verification system that actually means something rather than just clicking a box saying that you're 18. But, the biggest criticisms I get are from the libertarians, and they say, oh, well, parents could actually just start to parent their children and do a better job parenting. If we're being realistic, parents have to compete against a $97 billion a year adult entertainment industry. That is not possible. It's like parents having to fight big tobacco companies by themselves. We don't expect parents to just by themselves keep their children from smoking. We have laws that make it illegal for store clerks to sell and distribute cigarettes to minors, and for anyone to do that. All we're asking here is just for a little help from the state to keep pornography and harmful materials from getting in the hands of our children. And I don't think it's that much to ask.
Well, it's really interesting that you bring up the parental angle, because, of course, parents have been struggling now for the last 10 to 15 years to try and figure out, is it possible to keep porn out of the hands of kids? And I was at the NCOSE conference, the National Center for Combating Sexual Exploitation, not the one in D.C. last year, the one in Houston the year before. And one of the things that struck me was the executive director, who has several young kids, said, at this point, with the number of devices that are available, I've given up the idea that my kids will never see porn, and I've shifted to trying to prepare them for the first time they see it so that they will reject it. And I obviously believe 100%, I have children of my own, that it is my job first and foremost to try and keep these things away from them and train them how to respond to them if they do see them. But it's really interesting. It shows a lack of knowledge on the issue and how poisonous pornography is to claim the government should have nothing to do with this at all, especially based on the impact that this material does have on minds, which we're increasingly finding out, like the research done by Dr. Gary Wilson, who runs the website This Is Your Brain on Porn. And it was frustrating to watch this debate happen on Twitter with all these people saying, parents just want to outsource their job to the government, as if all parents are just being lazy and not bothering to watch their kids, and they want the nanny state to come in and make sure their kids don't end up looking at hardcore porn. So what's one of the best responses to this argument? Because I found it to be ill-informed, I hope inadvertently insulting, and also just sort of really naive about what we're facing. So is it that the libertarian folks over at Reason.com, I refer to them specifically because one of their responses to your article laid out how we should deal with porn as if pornography was still Playboys that you get at the back of a corner store wrapped in plastic, or bulky VHS cassettes behind the curtained off area at the back of a corner store. Is it that they just see pornography like that, or they think that the innocence of children of an entire generation is a price worth paying for libertarianism?
Yeah, I think that, well, one, I don't think they view pornography as being that harmful. I think that they view it as just another part of coming of age and your first sexual experiences. So I give them, while that's foolish and it's absolutely inaccurate, I do give them the benefit of the doubt that they just don't view pornography as being harmful to children. And that's why they don't want to restrict it. I think that there's a natural skepticism of giving government more power. I mean, after all, we do have a record of government constantly abusing power that we give them. However, what we're asking for is not that crazy. What we're asking is simply for laws that are already on the books to be enforced using technology that porn companies have already developed to protect the most vulnerable and susceptible people in our society to the harms of pornography. It's a very simple argument. We have all different types of laws that help parents protect their children. Like, for example, alcohol laws, raising keeping the age of alcohol sales to 21. And they just raised the age of cigarette purchases to 21. That's what I really find ironic, is that while we're raising the age for cigarettes, you can be drafted and called to fight in wars and die for your country at 18, but we're not going to give you cigarettes until you turn 21. But hey, if you're an 11-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old little boy who has a smartphone and you're playing Minecraft and you see an ad pop up that's pornographic in nature and you click it, we have no problem with the companies that are advertising that pornographic and harmful material to your 8-year-old son. That's where I start to question their common sense of libertarianism, and I think it's an example of how ideology and unhealthy ideology can adversely affect someone's judgment when it comes to just being commonsensical. Porn is harmful. It's very obvious that it's harmful. There is no question. You just have to ask yourself, would I want my little sister seeing this? Would I want my 8-year-old daughter seeing, the types of pornography out there? And I think that you also hit on a very important and good point, which is that a lot of people that are commenting on this, I don't think they realize how bad pornography has gotten. The state of pornography is radical. It's extreme, and it's because they know that, or they have a high confidence that no one's going to enforce the laws against them. This is not just, as I like to tell friends, this is not just boobs and butts. This is incredibly graphic, many times violent, stuff that you would never even discuss in front of pleasant company, let alone want your children ever coming across. So it's high time that we do it. It's really commonsensical. And the people that are, trying to blow this up as if it's something that's completely unreasonable, they're making a fool of themselves. And I'm fine with continuing this debate, because the longer it goes unaddressed, the more harmful and the more extreme the pornography is going to grow. And these people are going to continue to look foolish. And eventually, like the friend that you mentioned earlier, there are going to be enough victims of pornography, and they're going to realize how unhappy it's made them, where they stand up and they start to say just how pornography has harmed them. And, banning pornography is actually very popular with the American people, especially when it comes to women, but we can talk about that.
Well, yeah, no, we'll get to banning pornography in a moment, because one of the things I find interesting about what your case was and what the responses were, because I genuinely felt the libertarian responses said more about their knowledge of the issue than it did about the issue actually at hand, is if you read any of the latest research, so Dr. Gail Dine's book, Pornland, How Pornography Hijacked Our Sexuality, where she describes how the majority of pornography now is violent, some of it so extreme that it actually violates the Geneva Convention. One of the most comprehensive compilations of recent evidence is probably The Social Costs of Pornography, which is a collection of papers produced by the Witherspoon Institute. And there's one really fascinating and really horrifying article as part of that collection by Dr. Mary Ann Layden, who I think is one of the premier scholars on the issue of pornography, called Porn and Violence, A New Look at Evidence. And the stuff that you read in there is just staggering, because in essence, pornography is grooming a generation of women to subject themselves to violence in the romantic context, and grooming a generation of young men to believe that this is part and parcel of healthy sexuality. And we haven't really started looking into this issue in depth in terms of what is the society when the majority of young men and young women have been looking at material like this at earlier and earlier ages, age 11, as you cited earlier. What is that kind of society going to look like, especially in terms of gender relations? And when we're looking at building a coalition to respond to this issue, the old guard feminists were all very, very opposed to pornography. Andrea Dworkin famously wrote quite eloquently on this issue. Noam Chomsky was in favor of pretty much banning pornography outright. He addressed this in a really fascinating interview. Do you think that we could put this issue forward as a winning issue, or is the fact that so many people have been caught up in pornography and caught up in porn addiction, is that something that prevents us from building a coalition to take steps towards preventative action, do you think?
Yeah. So the conventional wisdom and this is, I think, one of the reasons why libertarians oppose addressing online pornography is that there are millions and millions of porn users across the country, and that addressing this issue would cause us, great political damage. But when you actually dig down into the polling and into the numbers, what you find is that there's a lot of people who feel addicted to pornography, and there are a lot of people who actually are addicted to pornography, but they feel a sense of shame from looking at pornography. There's a natural sense that what they're doing is unnatural and wrong, and that's not because of what anyone told them. I think it's because it's an unnatural act, and it's something that our bodies know to be unhealthy. But what we've also seen, there's a slate of polling that we just found out about a couple of weeks ago from Gallup that testing Americans' attitudes on pornography. And it's similar to the abortion issue in that when you put the extremes out there, so people that want no restrictions whatsoever on pornography, it's around 9% of the American people. So like the current status of affairs for where things are, where there's basically no restrictions for online pornography, is 9% support among the American people. Now, where you get into like the 50-60% range is when you ask people if online pornography should be restricted to people 18 years or older. And that's just 50 to 60% support for that. That's not counting the additional 30% of people who would support banning it entirely, regardless of how old you are online. When it comes to addressing online pornography, you have what's I refer to as a super political issue in getting political support. You're actually almost as likely to find a liberal woman who supports banning online pornography entirely as you are a conservative male. There is an interesting divide, an interesting wedge on the left when it comes to this with feminists. A large portion of feminists view pornography as exploiting women and taking advantage of them, which is absolutely true. And we should work to build a broad coalition on this issue. And there's a lot you can do with it, with building a coalition. If you look at the practical nature of what you could just start regulating and reforming right now, you could easily pass a ban on revenge pornography at the federal level. And you could get a lot of feminist support and a lot of conservative support. You could also most likely ban deep fake pornography, which is when you take someone's face from dozens of photos that they have and you put it onto a porn actress's face. And it basically looks like the person that you've taken a picture from is performing the sexual acts in the video. You could get a lot of Hollywood actresses involved in this. Scarlett Johansson is one of the most outspoken actresses against deepfake pornography. And I would argue that the third coalition aspect of this to have a broad sweeping bill would be to enact some type of age verification reform that's much more meaningful than just simply clicking a box. If you, for example, if you buy alcohol online, or if you buy cigarettes online, or if you buy a Juul product or vape online, you have to enter in a credit card to verify your age and access it. And the only rebuttal that I've gotten from that is that, well, yeah, but those products cost money. Well, the free pornography costs you something too, and what it costs you is your identity and you yourself. Pornographers are actually keeping very good track of who's watching, what porn, and where. They know your IP address. They know your mobile device identification number. They can figure out who you are from all of these pay-for sites or free sites. So you are paying something for it, and your privacy is being violated whether or not you realize it. They know who you are, they know what you watch, and they know what you like. And they're actually using your behavior to help them come up with new ideas for creating new pornography for what the market wants. And so if I was to build a broad coalition from ultra progressive left wing Democrats to ultra conservative right wing Republicans. I would ban deep fake pornography, revenge porn, and I would have some type of age verification. I think you could eliminate a lot of the harm that pornography is causing to America just by doing those three things.
Now, the interesting thing about what you proposed is that even with the split in the conservative movement about state interference and what the role of government should be, which took place, last year, triggered by the now infamous Sohrab Ahmari versus David French debate on the role of government, and this debate about pornography was seen as an outcropping of that. Although I disagree that that's entirely accurate, because David French is actually quite in favor of banning pornography to the extent that we can get it through constitutionally. And so when I saw his response to your article in this discussion, I thought, well, there's a really good starting point here. Let's take what the Sohrab Ahmari crowd wants and what the David French crowd wants, and there's a really good common ground here that can get us a pretty good chunk of the way there. They would be in favor of all of the things that you just proposed, for example. One of the ones that surprised me, though, was Ben Shapiro. I have his book, The Porn Generation, and I know his personal position on pornography is he's vehemently opposed, but he didn't seem to be too on board with the idea of taking steps against pornography. And I noticed that you two actually had an exchange. Do you think that he could be won over to the proposals that you just cited?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe that Ben is someone that's very commonsensical, and he's someone that I've been following for a very long time. And I understand completely where he's coming from, because I came from that position as well. But when it comes to laws and government, what I first ask is this necessary, and is this possible? And I think that once Ben realizes that this is not that crazy, all we're asking is for online pornography companies to live by the same rules and standards that we ask television companies and radio companies and movie production companies to live by. I think he'll realize that this really isn't that big of a government, that this is just, the internet is so new. It's only, the internet's only 30 years old, 35 years old. I mean, for what I mean by like public use, it's like 35 years old. It's a baby, basically, in the terms of like humanity. But it's if it's constitutional to regulate obscenity, then it's totally constitutional to regulate obscenity online. And, Ben might, I don't know, I imagine if you ask Ben if it's constitutional to ban prostitution, which is paying someone for sexual activity. Yeah. I think he would probably say that that's totally constitutional and within the state's right. To our state's power, ability to regulate. So pornography is paying someone to perform sexual acts.
Just with a camera on.
Yeah, just with a camera on. And it's even, I think that because of it having a camera and being accessible to literally billions of people across the globe, that it's probably even more important to ban than prostitution is. At least the prostitution houses you have to go out of your way to go to. These porn sites are in your pocket.
And they're looking for you. I always tell parents, even if your kids aren't looking for porn, the porn sites are looking for you. Like you cited the idea of online games with pop-ups, right? These are very, very intentional. This is being done because they want to draw kids in.
Well, and they need the kids to get hooked on pornography at a very early age. There's a lot of similarities between how the porn companies are operating with getting young children exposed to pornography at early ages, and how the cigarette companies used to operate. And quite frankly, I think that we should be taking much more immediate and direct action to regulate the online pornography companies than we do the cigarettes. I mean, one kills you after 50 years, and the other one ruins your entire life. It ruins your marriage. It ruins how you view the other sex. And it objectifies women. It ruins your mind, which, is corruptible much quicker and has much broader effects on society at large. I think that's one of the other things that's really upset me about this is the people that argue, well, you should just be a better parent. Okay. The internet, I mean, if you look at what's good on the internet, it's incredible. My kids love learning about dinosaurs on the internet. We went through every different type of animal and dinosaur throughout, the world history. And it is incredible. If you ever looked up, I've looked up with my daughter facts about the Titanic and the route it took and how they found out where it was sunk. It is a fascinating resource of information and materials that our children should be able to access freely and without a concern of ours. And the fact is that pornographers and porn users, people who are making money off of this, their rights to access pornography do not trump my rights as a parent or trump my children's rights as children to be free and innocent and pure and not have that stuff put up. Look, how I would explain this to Ben. Ben says, government regulation is required for the Environmental Protection Agency, right? So if you have a factory that's pouring sludge into a river, right, you have every right as a state or as a government agency to start regulating and putting sanctions on that business until they stop putting sludge into that river. This is no different. All we're asking for, we have a factory called online pornography, and it is all it's producing is sludge. I mean, at least the sludge is just a byproduct of the goods that the factory is producing. But we have a factory called Big Porn that is producing sludge, and it's giving it out to everyone, and it's corrupting them. And that's fine. We've determined that you have a right to corrupt your own mind. But what we're asking for is for these porn companies to take a little bit off of their profits and ensure proper compliance with the laws that are currently on the books to protect our children, protect our families, and protect America at large. It's not that hard. It's not to understand. The technology is already there. And if you're worried about privacy concerns, then we should probably take even further actions to restrict the rights of porn companies and the data that they're collecting on everyone. So I'm a all hands on board and everything above type of guy when it comes to this. So let's do it.
So where do you think this is going to go from here? So there was a lively debate that happened for the last few months of 2019. I noticed the LA Times just weighed in on it rather belatedly, I think last week on this debate. You had that letter from the congressman to the president asking that these obscenity laws be enforced. Where do you see this going? Do you think that this is going to get some traction? Can we expect this, at very minimum, debate to continue? And do you think that this discussion about pornography is going to have a key role in the ongoing conservative discussion about what the role of the state actually is?
Well, like everything else and like every other major fight we've had as a country, the success of our fight determines upon everyone else and whether or not we take action and get engaged in this. And I can tell you the organization that I run, American Principles Project, is planning to be very engaged and involved in this fight. And we don't plan to let it sit. We don't plan to let it die whatsoever. Yeah. What we're trying to do at American Principles Project is something that hasn't been done for a long time, and it's currently not being done. But we want to create a premier political organization for families, for parents who feel forgotten about through whether it's the economy or through social issues like pornography. We want to give them a voice. We want to organize them politically because that's what politicians respond to. Politicians respond to political power and whether or not certain issues and policies will elect them or unelect them. And so what we want to do is we want to take advantage of this vast majority of Americans who are married, they have children, and they're struggling from progressive influences, whether it's economic or social influences that are killing us. And we want to give them a political voice and organize them. And so if we can keep families engaged, if we can get enough parents to show up at town hall meetings for the members of Congress and push their members to support these common sense regulations. What I proposed in this thing, in this article in First Things, was not that crazy. And to be forward, it wasn't that hard to come up with. It just took the time of sitting down with my friends and allies at American Principles Project and also Nicosia. I do want to say, Nicosia, they're like the Babe Ruth of this issue. They've been involved. They've got so many great issues, and they're really big leaders on this, and they've been so helpful in guiding us and helping us. We've been working so closely with them, and I'm really glad that you went to their conference. And anyway, they're a great organization, but this fight only dies if we let it. And I think that the problem will continue to grow, and more and more families will continue to get involved and engaged. And we're going to win this fight. It's just a matter of time. But I definitely think it's winnable, and I definitely think that we will win in the end.
Well, as a final question, where can all of our listeners and viewers find your work at the American Principles Project?
Oh, it's very easy. You can go to AmericanPrinciplesProject.org. We're a 501c4, and we have a 501c3 organization, which is basically an advocacy and an education arm. But we've got a ton of resources up on our website that talk about why it's time to restrict pornography. We have articles explaining how we can do it in a constitutional way. But we also are preparing plans to help the family with the Family First agenda that it focuses on helping families both through the economy and on various issues like life and marriage and all of that. So AmericanPrinciplesProject.org is the best way to find us. And basically, if I were to sum it up in a one sentence way, we're the NRA for the family. We're helping make families great again by winning in politics. That's what we do, and that's what we're planning to do on years to come.
Well, Terry, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and talk about this issue.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jonathan. I really appreciate the conversation.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was my discussion with Terry Schilling of the American Principles Project on how to ban pornography. We hope you enjoyed this show, and if you want to check out past shows, head over to lifesitenews.com, click on the podcast tab. You can find this show on YouTube and all the podcast platforms, where you listen to your preferred content. Thanks so much for joining us, and we do hope you'll join us again next week.